Hello and welcome to another episode of Talking Till Dawn, the podcast where two very strange Scotsmen discuss the strange, the uncanny and the bizarre. I'm Michael Whitehouse and joining me tonight is the very, 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 very sexy Mr. Martin Yates.
I was going to say speak for yourself, Michael, referring to the very strange thing, but then you had to throw sexy in there and I can't deny that, so... Yeah, I'm good. I'm looking forward to hearing about the death of Santa.
Yeah, finally. You've been waiting all this time.
Finally.
That bearded bastard. we're getting rid of him. Christmas and the holiday season, whatever you celebrate, has few more iconic images than that of Santa Claus bedecked in red and white, climbing down the chimneys of the world into the warm, safe womb of people's living rooms, leaving presents beneath a tinselled Christmas tree before disappearing back up the chimney to continue on his gift-giving adventure until Christmas morning. But Christmas does have a darker side, and it plays host to strange and threatening tales. In Victorian times, people would tell ghost stories on Christmas Eve, and older pagan traditions suggest that the spirits of the dead rise up during the silent hours of dark and frosted Christmas mornings. This tradition of telling macabre stories to the delight and terror of all who listen has given birth not just to stories of supernatural entities walking the earth at night, but also to a very real and tragic tale of death.
That's what we like, Michael. That's what we're all about.
Tragic tales of death.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Good night. So this story, like many good tales of horror, there's a little kernel of truth in there somewhere. So let me retell this tale before we explore its horrific origins. It is Christmas Eve. A mother and father are getting their children ready for bed, but it's a difficult task. The children are excited for the arrival of Santa, but this family has a specific tradition in place. You see, each year the children actually get to see Santa Claus himself deliver the presents underneath the tree.
That's a fucking mind game.
Yeah, it is. While their father makes a scheduled run to help a neighbour with something, wink wink, nudge nudge. Actually, that sounds like he's having an affair with a neighbour, never mind that. The children wait in their pyjamas as the Christmas tree glistens gleefully. They are waiting for the same thing they have heard and seen each and every Christmas Eve. A thud sounds on the rooftop above. What's that? It's the sound of sleigh bells ringing, Martin.
Beautiful.
Then footsteps across the roof towards the chimney. Finally, the sound of something moving down the chimney towards the unlit fireplace. At this point, usually a soot-covered Santa Claus appears, joyful and jolly as ever. But on this Christmas Eve, he does not appear. The sound of bells was heard, so too were the footsteps, and even the unmistakable noise of something huffing and puffing its way down the chimney. But now Santa is stuck. He lets out a cry, a muffled shout from behind the thick brickwork. The mother smiles at the children, trying to hide her worry. She moves to the fireplace and looks up into the chimney. Sure enough, Santa is stuck. She tries to help, but she cannot reach him, and something worse is happening. Santa's pleas and screams are getting more desperate. You see, Santa slipped coming down the chimney, and he managed to wedge himself between the brickwork with the presents in his sack. No jokes about that, Martin, please. The force of this fall has made it almost impossible for him to breathe. He is completely constricted. Now, the mother, panicked, calls the emergency services. She shoos her children off to bed, swearing that Santa will be just fine as he cries out from behind the chimney.
I think now's a good time to come clean about the whole Santa thing.
It's not your dad, kids, it's not your dad. But it sounds like dad. It's not your dad, I swear. But he's using your names and all this. It's your dad. It's your dad stuck in here. It feels like eternity, but finally the ambulance and fire engine arrive. Firefighters do their best to dislodge Santa, but the only thing they can do is break the wall. They break up the brickwork with hammers and tools until a gaping hole reveals something blue. But Santa does not wear anything blue. It is the dead face of the children's father, asphyxiated by his fall, his eyes wide and bulging, and his face stark blue against the red and white hat still resting on his head. Merry Christmas, everyone! I'm sure many listeners will have heard this story or a variation of it. I don't know if you've heard this story before, Martin.
Not in this exact version. I've heard versions of like people maybe lighting a fire as someone's coming down the chimney.
Yep.
Things like that, but not this specific version. Variants of it, yeah.
So there are different variations of this story. Sometimes Santa slips and falls to his death at the bottom of the chimney in front of the children. Other times, even the mother does not know about the surprise, and Santa breaks his neck when getting stuck. Only when the smell of something rotten comes from the chimney days later does the family finally know where Daddy disappeared to. The most tragic version involves the mother lighting a fire and the father dying of smoke inhalation. So it's a grim tale, whichever version you've heard, and it's the type of Christmas story or urban legend that isn't too uncommon. It subverts what is supposed to be a fun, loving time of year about family, and even acts as a bleak coming-of-age tale. What's more tragic than discovering Santa isn't real in such a horrid way? But where does this story come from? And is there any truth to it? So, funnily enough, just before we started recording the podcast tonight, I mentioned to you recently, in fact just last night, I watched Gremlins.
Yeah.
And that's, for many people, their first exposure to this story.
Yeah, now you mention it. I was trying to remember whether it was Home Alone, but it might have been Gremlins. Yeah, it might well have been Gremlins.
It's Gremlins, yeah. So Phoebe Cates' character tells Billy what happened to her father in that film and why she doesn't celebrate Christmas. And it's the version of the story where he falls, he gets stuck in the chimney, breaks his neck, and it's meant to be a surprise for the entire family, and they only realise days later what's actually happened. So Gremlins was released in 1984, and this story has been around longer than that, as far as I can tell. The film may have introduced the urban legend to a new audience, but we have to look elsewhere for the source. There's a definite EC Comics vibe to this urban legend in some ways. In fact, EC Comics, who published Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear throughout the 1950s, subverted the joy of Christmas with seasonal grisly stories, with Vault of Horror's own All Through the House, about a maniac in a Santa costume, being iconic in its own right. You might have seen it in the...
Yeah.
It appears in the Tales from the Crypt TV series. And I think it actually appears in one of the Amicus anthology films as well, either Tales from the Crypt or Vault of Horror. So Joe Dante directed Gremlins, with Steven Spielberg producing, and these directors were hugely influenced by pop culture of the 1950s, including EC Comics. So it's no surprise that something containing many of the hallmarks of ghastly Christmas stories was included in Dante's Gremlins, a film itself juxtaposing the joy of Christmas with the arrival of tiny, malevolent creatures. Now, here's a strange thing. I can't definitively say that this story was around beforehand. I can't be 100% sure about it, simply because I don't have a written version of it in my possession that's older than that. But according to several books I could find in the subject revolving around urban legends, this one has been around for some time and does indeed predate the 1984 film. However, one of the books that I looked at on urban legends, I think it was the Big Book of Urban Legends it's called, and it was published in 1994, so that's 10 years later, but it states that this is a story that's been around for a while. So this is the problem with urban legends and their origins. These stories are oral mythologies. They are ostensibly a modern folklore, and folkloric tales are rarely written down. This is why folklorists who document such stories are doing such an important job collecting spoken stories for future generations. Now, the idea of Santa getting stuck coming down a chimney, as Snopes.com reports, has been immortalised in several songs, including Ella Fitzgerald's song Santa Claus Got Stuck in My Chimney from 1950.
I think there's a different meaning there, Michael. I think there was a subtext there that you might just be glossing over.
Do you know what? I never even thought of that. No way.
It was the 50s.
Your mind's in the gutter. So that predates even the aforementioned EC comic books. So other singers took a stab at this bizarre Christmas subgenre, including Jimmy Boyd with a similarly titled song. And this one is my favourite because it's so brutal. Giselle Mackenzie's song, Too Fat for the Chimney. I laugh at that, by the way, as a gentleman who is definitely heavier than he should be, so please, I'm not fat shaming. It's just so brutal. Too fat for the chimney.
That's excellent. Stop me if this is something you're going to come to, but, you know, architecturally, the vast majority of domestic chimneys could not be passed by a human being of any size from top to bottom. Never mind. There's obviously all these stories of, like, small children being sent up chimneys in the Victorian era to clean them up. They didn't go all the way to the top. If you actually look at, there was something on Reddit the other day of a Glasgow tenement as it was being demolished, and they demolished the wall that covered the chimneys, and you can see where the smoke has gone up over the decades and the centuries up through these chimneys. And the way chimneys work is they're not just like a clear channel to the roof, because rain and all sorts would come in. There's like 2 or 3 little shelves, and each time it goes up, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it's like maybe about a foot wide at the top. So,
but it's interesting you mention that, because I'm going to get to that as well. But there was a change in chimney design during the Victorian era. But we'll get to that. There are chimney designs where it is possible to climb into the house.
Okay.
But the laughter stops, at least it should, when I tell you that there are some very real deaths which may have given birth to this legend. I have to give great credit to journalist Mike Pearl, who wrote a fantastic article for Vice called A Brief History of People Getting Stuck in Chimneys and Dying. No messing about with that title, Mike.
That's what we're calling this episode, mate.
Yeah. You'll find a link to that article in the show notes. It's a riveting read, and it helped me greatly trying to find the origins of this urban legend. So Mike Pearl began writing that article after the grisly death of a man in California, recently in fact in November of 2015, and that made him research the topic. The incident took place in Fresno County after a homeowner lit the fire in his house. The house began to fill with smoke because the chimney was blocked, and then the screams of a man trapped inside were heard. Firefighters used jackhammers to break open the chimney, but tragically the man died. Now, this story was reported in the Los Angeles Times. I found the article, and gives a contradictory account of when the man actually died. It states at one point in the article that he was already dead when the rescuers reached him, but then later states that the county sheriff claimed that he was alive initially when they got to him, but died afterwards. But I don't believe even if he was awake at the time he said his name. It was later that the man was identified as Cody Caldwell, who had climbed into the chimney late at night, most probably to burgle the house, and then got stuck. He died of smoke inhalation and burns.
Jesus.
He was just 19 years old. And I'm not sympathetic towards people who break into people's houses, but it's just a tragic story anyway you look at it. So this story, along with Christmas 2015 fast approaching at the time, opened Mike Pearl's mind up to the history of people getting stuck in chimneys, and that's why I wrote this article. And this article is a wild read, and it sent me down further rabbit holes. And it proves once and for all that chimneys are death traps. Now, one of my favourite films is Mary Poppins. I could go into why I love it so much, but I'll leave that for a film discussion podcast and you can tear it apart, Martin. Suffice to say, one of the main characters in that film is a chimney sweep.
Yeah.
There are elaborate scenes showing how jolly and happy, like Santa Claus, chimney sweeps are supposed to be, at least in that fictional world.
Who'd have thought that a flue for evacuating noxious fumes and fire would be a dangerous place to hang out?
Yeah, I know. But this article shows the brutal reality. The truth is that during the 19th century, when chimney sweeps were needed in almost every house to keep chimneys clear and safe, many chimney sweeps died. Not just from stumbling or being blown off a roof on a windy day, but actually by getting stuck inside a chimney stack.
Getting blown off a roof on a windy day sounds like quite a pleasant way to go when you put it like that.
Yeah, definitely. In the book of The Sweepers of Old and the Climbing Boys, Henry Mayhew describes the reality of being a chimney sweep as a life often cut short in the most brutal fashion. In fact, I found another article that gives a great summary on this topic called Climbing Boys of the 1700s and 1800s. It's written by Jerry Walton and describes how many chimneys were so narrow, as you said, Martin, that only children could fit inside. Children then were forced into the most horrific of jobs, having to navigate these dark, suffocating environments. But here's a quote from a magazine from 1802 about this practice, referring to a Mother Brown rig who had a number of children at her disposal. She made the poor boys get up every morning at 3 o'clock and go out without shirt, shoes or stockings to sweep chimneys.
Chimneys?
It is actually spelled chimneys in that, yeah.
Chimney cricket?
When they came home, they were forced generally to scour the stairs and of every other kind of drudgery before they got their scanty meals. These children had to climb up through the chimneys, trying not to slip or fall to their death, and above all, avoiding getting stuck. They used metal brushes to rub away any soot, which they then inhaled in that enclosed environment. If they didn't climb up fast enough or got scared, the adult chimney sweep standing below would poke, prod, or even light a fire under the child's feet to force them back up to the top.
Jesus.
It's mental. It's mental. It was really depressing reading about this stuff. It was just like...
I had heard a bit about this before. And to think that when they decided that children were no longer allowed to go up chimneys, they just invented a longer brush.
Yeah, I know.
They were mechanised out of business by a longer brush.
Yeah.
So kids went through all of this because they didn't have long enough brushes.
Yeah.
Wild.
So just how dangerous was being inside these chimneys? A writer named James Montgomery gives us this horrifying account of what happened to a 13-year-old boy from 1846. Tempted by a promise of sixpence, the boy went into the flue with a fire already burning.
Jeez.
Before he reached the top, however, the soot fell down in such quantities the chimney was soon in blaze, and the poor boy struggled to the bottom through the flames and was dragged out by the legs before he came direct upon the live coals in the grate. He was so miserably scorched that he died after lingering 3 weeks in excruciating torture.
That's horrendous.
Yeah, so in researching this topic, the world of the chimney sweep and the climbing boys is worthy of a podcast on its own. So I'll say this about that terrible practice. The occupation of chimney sweep was so common, children were often required to support their families through work back then from such an early age, that it seems that instances of deaths, including asphyxiation, falling and burning, were embedded into the mindset of Victorian Britain. Considering that Santa Claus himself is a European creation, though obviously Americanised throughout the last century through the iconic Coca-Cola images that we all know now, it doesn't seem to be such a leap to say that in Britain and other countries with similar practices, that any time someone entered a chimney, there was the real fear that they wouldn't come out.
Mm-hmm.
This could then be where the legend of someone dressed as Santa dying in a chimney on Christmas Eve comes from, though of course this is speculation on my part, but I think a reasonable one. If you go back to the famous songs surrounding Santa in this chimney, when I was a kid there was a popular song we would sing during assembly at school at Christmas time, again called When Santa Gets Stuck Up the Chimney. Did you sing this, Martin?
No.
No, you didn't know this song?
No.
Maybe it was just my school, but interestingly, the origin of the word stuck may have actually been a professional term invented or adapted by chimney sweeps themselves. In fact, the word doesn't appear until 1885, and some have suggested this is where the term comes from. The fact that the word stuck might originate from people being trapped inside chimneys is another, albeit loose, piece of evidence that the death of Santa in these circumstances may have come from the terrible practice of forcing children up into the soot-covered darkness. And this weighed heavily on me while researching this topic because Christmas is often about children.
Yeah.
And the creation of Santa as a myth is there again to reward children, and yet the very nature of these tales, the very idea of a human being having to even go down a chimney or up a chimney, might originate from the deaths of hundreds if not thousands of children themselves. And that gave me a chill when I made the connection.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, people dying in chimneys has continued on long since the Victorian age. In 1977 in Los Angeles, a 14-year-old child named Robert Thompson, who had learning difficulties, was found lodged inside the chimney of a halfway house. Horrifyingly, it has been suggested that he starved to death.
Oh, God.
Yeah, some have also suggested that he was murdered.
When was that?
1977. And this isn't the only unresolved case of people found in chimneys. In 1928, a 6-year-old girl and a 19-year-old man vanished together, and they were finally found dead inside a chimney.
What?
No one knows how they got there or why.
What did they die of?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think the whole point about that one is that maybe the cause of death was never reported.
That's insane.
So, not all of these bizarre instances result in death. In 2015, a woman in Riverside, California, got stuck in a chimney trying to steal back her kids from her ex-boyfriend. I shouldn't laugh at that. I'm sure she had cause. But most of these strange cases are dwarfed by the sheer volume of people getting stuck in chimneys for the very same reason the first victim we mentioned, Cody Caldwell, did. Because chimneys are, in some circumstances, viable entrances to properties for burglars. I know we talked about some of the architectural changes, but as far as I can tell, and I'm not an expert in chimneys, so please do correct me if I'm wrong about this, but as far as I can tell, there are some places where you can get down the chimney into the house. It may be that these are cabins and things like that. Maybe they're not quite what we would consider to be
grand old houses, maybe, like,
yeah,
with fireplaces that are like the size of your room, you know, huge big old fireplaces.
Yeah. And I'm certain that at some point someone has dressed up as good old Santa Claus and come down a chimney.
Yeah.
I'm positive of that. It must have happened.
Yeah.
So far, while we can say that the legend of Santa being stuck in a chimney and dying might come from a terrible practice of forcing children into chimneys during the Victorian era in Britain, a verified singular origin story remains elusive. So don't worry if you hear noises coming from your walls. It's probably just rats or the ghosts of children.
Great.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas. You've got rats.
Yeah. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's a surprisingly grim subject. I was thinking, yeah, people getting stuck in chimneys, that's kind of comical, isn't it? But no, it's actually horrific. A little boy getting pulled onto hot coals. Oh. Yeah. You hear, oh yeah, it was terrible for poor little old Victorian kids getting put up chimneys, but when you hear the details of it,
yeah,
depressing doesn't even touch it.
Yeah, you imagine it just being like, oh, okay, it's a bit cramped.
Yeah, they're not really paid very much, and it's dirty, dark, and yeah.
But really, it's like, no, loads of them died.
Yeah, they're disposable.
I wonder what the death toll was.
Yeah. And the long-term effects of the soot and everything. Imagine the vast majority of them didn't die up the chimney, but they may have died many years younger than they would have done because of inhalation of smoke and soot and God knows what else.
Yeah. And these kids were probably in a situation where they were either on their own or kind of forced to work because they had to help support their families.
Yeah. I mean, there's no safety net. Yeah. It's one of those things like we were talking about in the last episode. There was no safety net to help them. There was additionally no health and safety. And when something like that happened, it was like, oh, well, that's an accident. That's a shame. They didn't have the culture that we have today. Maybe sometimes today the culture goes too far the other way, but we didn't have the culture of going, look, who is responsible for this that has happened? They need to be held accountable.
Yeah.
You know, the culture of civil compensation, of being held legally responsible for a life being taken. If you employ someone and they die due to your negligence nowadays, that's manslaughter at best. But in those days it was just an accident, and whoever was sending the kids up the chimney probably just got to go and do it to someone else.
Yeah, that's terrible.
Horrific.
And it's probably one of these things that everyone accepted went on, and then all of a sudden there was a moral panic about it.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, and then people were like, oh, it was mentioned in the House of Commons, it must now be changed.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's been going on for so long, you know, but
probably someone sitting there going, well, we've been doing it for years, why change it now?
Plenty of young children.
The Tories.
Let's not get political. I tried to find a quote from Joe Dante about the story that Phoebe Cates says in Gremlins, and that's where most people are familiar with this story, because I thought, well, maybe he's heard it from somewhere or read it somewhere specific, but the only thing that I could find was that the studios tried to get them to cut that story out of Gremlins, because if you actually watch Gremlins, although it's a monster film, that moment is a distinct tonal shift into something that's really grim and tragic in a way that the rest of the film isn't. The rest of the film's like a kind of cartoon, but I remember watching that as a kid. If you haven't caught a lot of Joe Dante movies, and you were mentioning Inner Space earlier on before the podcast, like Joe Dante has made some terrific films, and he makes real life cartoons in a way that no one else really does. I'm a real big fan of his, so I would definitely check out those. And it's the season for watching Gremlins. Take your mind off of an even greater horror in the world and watch Gremlins. I couldn't find anything directly about that, but do you ever remember the Darwin Awards?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you can make arguments about whether that's in poor taste or not, but some of them are really, really ridiculous. And I just think somebody has dressed up as Santa and went into the chimney.
Yeah, but you weren't able to find it.
No, but then, to be fair, we're doing mini episodes, and I didn't spend as much time researching this episode as I would have, a longer full episode. So maybe I would have found it.
You're going to read about this tomorrow. You're going to find it tomorrow.
Yeah. So, I mean, please, if there are any listeners who know anything about this story or want to correct me about whether you can actually get inside some chimneys, please contact us at talkingtilldawn@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Or if you want to talk to us about anything else podcast related, that would be great.
Yep.
But I think the sun is rising.
Before we go, actually, I'll just say...
No, step back down below the horizon immediately.
Hopefully, we're going to have another one of these shorter episodes out. I'm hoping it's going to be out on the 29th of December. I really hate to put a date on it because I know what we're like with getting things out on dates, but there is a reason I'm aiming to get it out on the 29th of December, but certainly by the end of the holiday period.
Because you're part of a cult that believes that the earth will end in the 30th.
Yep. No one's going to hear it if I put it out on the 30th.
That would just be the icing on the cake for this year.
Hail Zenu. No, yeah, so keep your eyes peeled for that.
Please have a Merry Christmas or whatever you like to celebrate at this time of year. And I know it's a difficult time for everyone. We're just going into another lockdown now, but there's light at the end of the tunnel and just...
Light at the top of the chimney, mate.
Aye, COVID's the chimney sweep at the bottom of the chimney. But things will get better, so please everyone hang in there, and we'll see you all soon. So the sun is coming up, and it's time for me to say good night.
Night, guys.